Fish will come to order, and good morning to everyone. And I want to welcome our very distinguished witnesses and all those who are interested in this very, very important topic of global online freedom. Sadly, online censorship, surveillance, and the intimidation of online speech is not restricted to countries where it is commonly reported, especially China, Vietnam, and Iran. It is increasingly common in member states of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, broadly speaking, in Europe and the former Soviet Union. With this hearing, we seek to draw the world's attention to the arrest of bloggers, to the blocking of websites, the surveillance and intimidation of peaceful political activists, to aggressive denial of service attacks, and to violent intimidation by some OSCE member states. For example, Belarus is blocking social networking sites, such as Twitter and Facebook, and temporarily shutting down opposition internet sites. Turkey is set to require a mandatory nationwide internet filtering system on August 22nd, unprecedented in scope in the OSCE space, and compounding the already aggressive blocking of around 14,000 websites and broad restrictions on content. Kazakhstan, which already blocks a number of popular blogs and media sites, is also in the process of creating a national internet, having recently decided that all .kz domain names will have to operate on physical servers within its borders. No less disturbing is the violent intimidation of dissent in Russia. Though Russia does not aggressively censor terms or significantly block access to information on the internet, as China does, it has its own crude but effective methods for controlling the internet. Mafia thugs in league with the government beat people and instill fear in Russian bloggers and journalists. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, quote, online journalists in Russia and throughout the region whose work appears on the Russian language internet known as Runet have faced physical intimidation, attacks, and threats for far longer than has been widely noted in either Moscow or in the West. In a report issued by OpenNet Initiative, the authors, one of whom is here with us today, concluded that internet controls in the Commonwealth of Independent States have evolved, quote, several generations ahead of those used in other regions of the world. Runet controls are not only mirroring past oppression, the author said, they're foreshadowing the future of internet control worldwide. The prospect of the internet environment deteriorating to that level is frightening and surely is a call to action. At the signing of the Helsinki Final Act in 1975, President Gerald Ford stated that history will judge the signatories, quote, not by the promises we make, but by the promises we keep. This is as true now as it was then. All 56 OSCE states have agreed to respect their citizens' human rights and fundamental freedoms, including the freedom of expression. But some do not do so and are not only improving, but even backsliding. And I do look forward to our witnesses today and what they can do or what they will recommend as to how we might turn this around. Turning to our first panel, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Daniel Baer, Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Department of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and his portfolio includes the Internet Freedom Office. Dr. Baer was sworn in as Deputy Assistant Secretary on November 23rd of 2009. Prior to joining the Department of State, Dr. Baer was Assistant Professor of Strategy, Economics, Ethics, and Public Policy at Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business, where he taught business ethics to MBA and undergraduate students. In 2007 and 2008, he was a faculty fellow at the Edmund J. Safra Foundation Ethics Center for Ethics at Harvard. In 2004 to 2007, he worked at the Boston Consulting Group, was project leader, and provided strategic advice to leaders in corporate government and nonprofit sectors. Dr. Baer has also worked in the Office of African Affairs, the Office of East Asian and Pacific Affairs, and the Office of Multilateral and Global Affairs. So he has a very, very wide swath of experience, and we are deeply grateful to have him here today to testify before the Commission. So, Dr. Baer, please proceed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your affording me the opportunity to address an issue with profound implications for the exercise of human rights in the OSCE region and across the globe, ensuring a free and open internet. This hearing is emblematic of the Commission's strong defense and dedicated promotion of human rights principles enshrined in the core of the Helsinki Final Act and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I valued the opportunity to work with members of the Commission and your superb staff. The Commission's efforts greatly strengthened my hand and that of Assistant Secretary Posner and our colleagues at the State Department as we work with other governments, civil society advocates, and the private sector to defend and advance human rights and democratic governance. Can I also take a moment to thank you for inviting the other witnesses you've welcomed here today. I'm thrilled to be here with my friends David and Dunya, both of whom I admire a great deal, and also with Mr. Rosinski and Mr. Siegel. I feel honored to be in such great company, and I know that Mr. Lee will share his views too, and I'm glad for that. Mr. Chairman, I endeavored in my written testimony to respond to your specific requests and to highlight key trends and concerns regarding a number of countries in the OSCE region, many of which you just highlighted yourself, as well as to describe what we are doing institutionally within the OSCE to protect and advance internet freedom. And I'd like to make just a few brief general comments here and then take whatever specific questions you might have. First, I want to say a few words about why we, the United States, are committed to internet freedom. The United States champions internet freedom because it derives from universal and cherished rights, the freedoms of speech, assembly, and association. An open internet gives people a neutral platform from which to express their legitimate aspirations and shape their own destinies. As Secretary Clinton has emphasized, the rights of individuals to express their views freely, petition their leaders, worship according to their beliefs, these rights are universal, whether they are exercised in a public square or in an individual blog. The freedoms to assemble and associate also apply in cyberspace. In our time, people are as likely to come together to pursue common interests online as in a church or a labor hall. As we all know, the internet and other new technologies are having a profound effect on the ability to organize citizen movements around the world. And because repressive regimes understand this power, they are redoubling their efforts to control it. Recently, in Vilnius, on the margins of the Community of Democracy's ministerial meeting, Secretary Clinton and I met with a number of activists, including several from the OSCE region, who spoke of the surveillance, hacking, and harassment they face every day. As Assistant Secretary Posner said earlier this week, these are the acts of governments that fear their own people. In cracking down on the internet, they expose their own lack of legitimacy. But speech is harder than ever to control in the digital age, and young people who have taken to the streets this year understand that it isn't pornography or pirating that's being suppressed. It's people and their legitimate demands for dignity and a say in the political and economic futures of their countries. As President Obama said in Cairo back in 2009, suppressing ideas never succeeds in making them go away. The actions of these governments remind us of a basic truth. Governments that respect their citizens have no reason to fear when citizens exercise their rights. And governments that respect the rights of their citizens have no reason to fear a free internet. Of course, repressive governments are also missing out. The internet can be a force for social and political stability if governments use it as a way to better communicate with their citizens and to serve them in an open and transparent fashion. The internet offers an early warning signal for public discontent, and therefore a way to address grievances before they erupt into protests. As Assistant Secretary Posner said, governments should not shoot the instant messenger. They should address the underlying problems that cause citizens to lose faith in their governments and in the future. Mr. Chairman, we are not cyber utopians who believe that the internet is the magic answer to the world's human rights problems. Technology does not change the world. People must. And we must not forget that calls for freedom still spring from human dreams and resonate in human hearts, even if they are shared by keystrokes and text messages. That's why we take a person-centered approach. Through our diplomacy, through direct support for embattled activists worldwide, we are helping people stay one step ahead of the censors, the hackers, and the brutes who beat them up or imprison them for what they do online. Since 2008, thanks to Congress's support, we have committed $50 million in direct support for activists on the front lines of the struggle against internet repression. By the end of 2011, we will have allocated $70 million toward these efforts. Our programming responds to the most urgent priorities we hear from activists on the ground, including embattled democracy and human rights activists from the OSCE countries. We're committed to a free and open internet because it follows from our commitments to fundamental freedoms and universal values. These commitments, like all human rights commitments, are part of who we are, part of, as the title of this hearing suggests, the promises we keep. And of course, it's also part of the promises at the center of the OSCE. Mr. Chairman, as you know, the OSCE was the first regional organization to recognize that respect for human rights, pluralistic democracy, and the rule of law are prerequisites for a lasting order of security and prosperity. And the OSCE was the first regional organization to acknowledge the vital importance of civil society. The Helsinki process must continue to be a pioneer for human dignity, civil society, and democratic government in the digital age. Challenges to internet freedom in the OSCE region are illustrative of the issues we are addressing across the globe. Mr. Chairman, as you know, in the past, the Helsinki process was a major international platform for defending citizens expressing dissenting views via samizdat and for protesting the jamming of radio broadcasts. Today, email, social networking, and text messaging are new forms of samizdat, as well as indispensable tools of commerce, education, and global communications. As the United States has done since the inception of the Helsinki process, so too, in this new century, we stand with those in the OSCE region who seek to peacefully exercise their fundamental freedoms and promote and protect human rights, including via new technologies. The United States will take every opportunity to work with the Lithuanian chair, the EU, and other participating states and civil society to ensure that the OSCE sends a clear message from Vilnius on internet freedom. If I were to distill that message into a tweet to the world, it would be enduring freedom, new apps. Mr. Chairman, as you said, when he signed the Helsinki Final Act 35 years ago, President Ford famously said that history will judge this conference not by what we say here today, but by what we do tomorrow. Not by the promises we make, but by the promises we keep. He was right then, and his statement is even more true today. In this digital age, keeping our promises greatly depends on ensuring that the internet is open and free. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission. I'd be glad to take your questions.
Dr. Baer, thank you very much for your testimony and for your leadership. This is certainly one of the cutting-edge areas of human rights, and in the alternative, the suppression of those rights by tyrannies, tyrannical governments, and dictatorships. Let me ask you just a few questions, if I could. We know Belarus, and we've had reports that in Belarus, the Chinese has cyber police, and the experts in controlling the internet have shared best practices there so that Lukashenko can better repress the dissidents and the democracy activists. What kind of information do we have regarding that kind of collaboration, not just in Belarus, but in perhaps some of the other more repressive regimes in the OSCE region?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think what you've highlighted is what we see as a growing trend in the last few years, which is that, as you said, there's a increasing sharing of what we might call worst practices in terms of internet repression. And as governments are sharing, as nefarious governments are sharing their methods for repressing online speech or assembly, they're also developing new ones. They're innovating and sharing, which makes it even more challenging. And so certainly we are seeing, we do believe that governments are sharing techniques, and you know we are trying to respond in kind. We're trying to make sure that we are staying in touch with people on the ground, and that we're listening to the new threats that they're seeing. You mentioned Belarus. We know that in Belarus, as you talked about, there's been denial of service attacks, there's monitoring, there's shutdowns. It's a kind of confluence of a number of internet threats, and we're listening to people on the ground there and elsewhere and trying to make sure that we're providing them the support they need.
But are the Chinese, is Beijing providing the all-important expertise to help Lukashenko and the others?
Without, I'd be happy to brief you in private on particular country concerns, but I think that it is fair to say that there is information sharing going on between a number of countries in terms of how to limit online speech,
including China,
and activity. Including
China.
I would expect that there's information sharing going on between countries that limit the internet.
Okay, let me ask you. Several years ago, I held a hearing that lasted some 8 hours. It was the longest hearing I've ever chaired. We had Google, Cisco, Yahoo, and Microsoft testify. And frankly, at the time, all four of those large companies were totally reluctant to share information and enabling of the Chinese dictatorship when it comes to repression via the internet. Google, since, has come around to some extent, and I think a large extent. They now support the Global Online Freedom Act. Yahoo actually moved personally identifiable information when they set up shop in Vietnam, and they put that out of reach of the internet police, if you will, in Hanoi. And Microsoft and Cisco, however, seemed to be moving forward unperturbed by how their enabling of a dictatorship has led to arrests. And in the case of Cisco, they're selling capabilities that, the Interpol and the FBI, state-of-the-art police techniques, sharing of information, routers. It's just extraordinary. PoliceNet, which gives the secret police extraordinary capabilities. And I'm wondering if you're seeing those companies and others exhibiting the same kind of enabling of dictatorship in the OSCE space.
I think you're right to highlight the importance of private companies in the internet freedom conversation. Most of the internet is made up of private assets, and obviously most of us use the services that companies provide. That's how we access the internet. I think that what we've seen in the last few years, as you rightly point out, is an evolution in the way that companies are thinking about this. I think that increasingly companies are realizing, and we should never forget that companies are made up of people, and people who often, when they understand the nature of the consequences, perhaps unintended consequences of decisions they make, can manage around them. And so, one of the initiatives that we're quite keenly following is the Global Network Initiative, which is made up of Microsoft, Yahoo, and Google. The director of the Global Network Initiative is here with us today. I saw her in the audience before I came in. That's meant to be a way for companies to come together and talk about what a principled approach to doing business in this space looks like, and to make commitments to do so. And I think we see that as a promising way forward, both because it establishes commitments, but it also provides a forum for companies to share quite practically the challenges they're facing. So, you brought up the issue of storing data outside of Vietnam. That was a lesson learned from the Chitao case. Yeah. Storing data where you store data matters, and so that's a practical conversation that companies can have. I think that this is an evolving conversation. I think it's one that's important. We should keep our eye on. I think that there are a number of companies and actors within companies that are taking a lead on this, and who recognize that this is a conversation that they have to be a part of.
Let me just ask two final questions and yield to Dr. Gingrey. I mentioned earlier, or you mentioned it as well, that with regards to obscenity and issues of that kind, and I will be reintroducing the Global Online Freedom Act shortly. The previous versions, in any version, makes it very clear that we're talking about nonviolent political speech, nonviolent religious speech, conscience, but not obscenity, as even the Supreme Court has said is not protected speech, and I think you would agree with that. But how would you recommend we deal with the hate speech, especially the anti-Semitic speech that is very often generated in this country? I do believe passionately in free speech, but there are lines that need to be drawn, and some of the anti-Semitic speech that I've seen on the internet is just without parallel. The hatred and the animosity towards Israel and Jews in particular. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I appreciate your raising that, and I think it's one of the places that we have room to continue and bolster the conversation going forward. I work very closely. My office is next door, and I was sworn in on the same day as and with Hannah Rosenthal, our special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. And we've talked about this several times, and how we can really foster a conversation that reckons with the fact that a commitment to free speech entails also a commitment to speak out when hateful speech is put into the public sphere, to defeat it through the force of argument, and to express our disapproval of those kinds of utterances. I think that there's obviously the challenge that arises, as you point out, is that we want to be very careful about any limitations on speech, because we know that while well-intentioned actors may use them well-intentionedly, other actors will exploit those as an excuse to limit the kinds of speech that ought not be limited. And so that's the challenge that we face in this conversation. And I think we remain committed. Hannah has been pounding the pavement, traveling the world, speaking out against it. We remain committed to fostering a conversation that deals with hate speech and recognizes it as an onerous and terrible thing.
Okay. I would just add, many of our colleagues in the European countries, including France and a number of the other countries, are very concerned about the anti-Semitic speech and are befuddled as to why we can't make a clear distinction between grossly hateful speech and freedom of speech. Two final questions. Internet restricting countries. If you were to say which countries in the OSCE space are the worst, if you could tell us what those countries are. And with regards to the money that has been appropriated to pierce the firewalls, in particular the firewall in China, the Falun Gong, as you know, has developed an extraordinary capability to pierce that firewall so that people can access the internet without fear of government intrusion, almost, if for want of a better word, an unfettered access to the internet. Why hasn't that money flowed to them since they have a off-the-shelf capability? I mean, I spent the better part of 3 hours 6 months ago with some of their practitioners, some of their technological people, tech people, and I was amazed, and I understand from peer reviews that it does work. Will that money indeed flow to them so that they can do that work?
On your first question, in terms of internet restricting countries, it's a difficult ranking to make because of the dynamism of the way that threats are evolving. So, whereas in one country you may have extraordinary legal restrictions, you mentioned the pending new filtering regime that is set to take place in Turkey. In another country, you may have threats that are good old-fashioned brutality mixed with online activity. So, we're concerned about actions in Russia to punish bloggers or things like that. I mean, obviously, Belarus continues to be a prime concern, but you mentioned the countries that you mentioned in your opening statement. I would say we have concerns about all of them. All of those countries are areas of concern, and in different ways. And one of the challenges, not only in our policy but also in our programming, and I'll talk about our programming now, is to respond to the specific context of each country. That's why we keep in such good touch with people on the ground, because what the tools that are needed, the supports that are needed in one place may not be the same as the tools or supports that are needed in another, and we're working very hard to deliver customized supports to the people on the ground.
If you were to say, what are the top 5, or the worst 5, I should say, just so we can better hone our focus?
State Department guys get in big trouble when we make ranking lists on the fly. I think I would say the handful of countries that you mentioned in your opening statement would certainly pass muster as a top 5. In terms of your question about the programming, first of all, let me reiterate our thanks for Congress's support for Internet freedom programming. We see that as essential to the United States' global push to advance and support Internet freedom. The way that we approach this is to take a venture capitalist style approach. Part of the challenge, again, is the fact that whereas 5, 10 years ago, there was really only one salient threat to internet freedom, and that was blocking. Increasingly, what we're seeing is, in the cases of Belarus and others are prime examples, is that it's not just blocking, it's the fact that people can't associate or communicate securely. It's the fact that their websites get attacked by nefarious actors and taken down. And so we need a range of tools. And we also need to make sure that the people on the ground know how to use them and know how to use them safely so that they're not putting themselves or others at risk. So our portfolio of investments includes a range of tools, including circumvention technology, which you brought up, as well as other tools to help people communicate securely and to keep their websites up, et cetera, as well as the training or the underground railroads that distribute those and give people the kind of cyber self-defense training that they need. In terms of the specific tool that you brought up, it is one of the tools in our portfolio. We don't comment publicly on our grants because we want to give our grantees the discretion to do so. That has been publicly brought up by the grantee, and I'd be happy to, I have met with your staff in the past, and I'd be happy to meet again to talk about the upcoming round of grants. I think you'll be quite pleased by the portfolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Dr. Baer. The old saying comes to mind, it's easy to recognize a speck in someone else's eye, yet we might indeed have a plank in our own Let me ask you this question. We've had some hearings, in fact, recently on internet security in this country, more in regard to advertisers, cookies and tracking people and off of social networks and websites, et cetera, and how we should really strike that balance. And the United States itself has certainly faced some recent criticism for its push to obtain personal information and the private correspondence, as I said, of social media users in the name of things like combating terrorism, pursuing criminals, or even to serve legal notices to our citizens. Does the government's reach in these areas deter users in this country from freely utilizing the internet services, and are not these intrusions affecting freedom of expression on the internet in the United States?
Thank you very much, Congressman. I think that the question you pose reflects what we have long acknowledged, which is that there are challenges to preserving a free and open internet and making sure that we're taking care of security concerns, law enforcement concerns, and harnessing the full commercial power of the internet. Just because there are challenges doesn't mean they're unsolvable. There are challenges in the offline world to figuring out how to make sure that we are permitting companies to do business and innovate and develop new ideas, as well as making sure that consumers are protected, et cetera. So I don't think they're necessarily new challenges, but they're certainly challenges. I think you know, the Secretary in her Internet Freedom speech this year in February laid out a number of those tensions and the tensions that we face in crafting policy. And you know, in some sense, it's even harder in this sphere because the technology evolves so quickly that it's at a hyper speed, and so you have to be incredibly careful in the way that you respond, the policy response. And I think that's why it's so important that we have guiding principles, that we have our commitments to free expression, that we have the commitments that are in our Constitution, the commitments to fundamental freedoms that are in the Helsinki Final Act, and that we don't lose sight of those as we attempt to craft policy to manage the commercial and security aspects of the internet.
If you could maybe give us some specifics, what the State Department overall is doing within OSCE to combat the attacks on freedom of speech, association on the internet. You've in general said that in response to some of these countries that Chairman Smith talked about, that you're ready, willing, and able from the State Department perspective to assist. But what specifically, if you could give us some?
Well, obviously we have specifically we have programs and we have diplomacy with the OSCE member states. But within the OSCE, our ambassador Ian Kelly raises these issues in the Permanent Council on a regular basis. And we, in the lead up to the Astana summit last year, we worked very hard to develop language that we hoped would be part of the plan of action coming out of the summit. As you know, there was no plan of action adopted at Astana, but we are going to work again this year in the run-up to the upcoming ministerial in Vilnius in December to try to make sure that a statement affirming the application of the same fundamental freedoms that have applied offline, the fact that they apply online, and not just freedom of expression, but of assembly and association as well. We're going to try to get that language into the outcome document from the Vilnius ministerial as well. And we'll continue to raise these issues as we can within the OSCE. I would say that I think that one of the great assets of the OSCE in terms of internet freedom is the next witness that you'll hear from. Dunya's work has been, first of all, she never stops. She's everywhere all the time, working with governments. I see her at blogger conferences. I see her all over the place, and we work together very well. And I've really appreciated the work that she's done. I think she's a clarion call. Her reports and her statements really do call out the areas in which we should all be focused within the OSCE region. So I would point to her as one of the successes of the OSCE in internet freedom. Yeah,
well, it seems to me, and this is certainly, I'm not being critical of it, but it sounds to me that it's just a matter of expressing in a formal manner our righteous indignation over some of these things and shining the light of day on activities, and hopefully in embarrassing the bad actors into behaving. But in regard to real specifics, any kind of a hammer, it really doesn't sound that you've described one to me, and maybe it's not needed, but it seems like to me it would be very helpful if we had that.
I think you're right. I think there are opportunities to operationalize the commitment to internet freedom in other aspects of the OSCE and ODIHR. There will be opportunities on the ground in field offices, et cetera. But as we look back at the history of the OSCE, I think in many respects the hammer that the OSCE has is the incontrovertible, undeniable truth of the principles on which it's founded. And so I think that to the extent that all of us continue to call out violations of those principles, that is the hammer, and it's not ineffective.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And, thank you very much, Dr. Baer, and Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me ask you just a couple of questions. After the Arab Spring, where the internet was credited with so much of the Egyptian revolution, have we seen more restrictions on internet activity in other places around the country, around the world?
It varies. In some places, yes, although we don't. It's hard to attach causality to that. After the Arab Spring, when the stories were written, many of them were breathless about the fact that the internet had played a major role. And to me, I've said, you've got a bunch of 20 and 30-somethings and the whole range of society, but a lot of 20 and 30-somethings that the stories were focused on. If there were stories about them doing something that didn't involve the internet, that would be the story. I mean, these days, the internet is so much woven into daily life and indeed into the story of human rights that it's necessarily part of the story. And because of that, I mean, I think we do see that that other governments are certainly paying attention. They are, whether or not they're taking action, they're paying attention to what's going on.
So you haven't seen a spike?
I mean, I think we've seen certainly increase. We were worried about the trend in China in the last 6 months. There's been increasing extrajudicial detention of lawyers, et cetera, crackdowns on religious groups, et cetera. But I don't know whether we would causally link that to the Arab Spring.
You co-opted the chairman's 4 or 5 countries. What would be the next 4 or 5 countries?
I'd like to take that question.
You'd like to take that question?
I'd like to take that question and come back to you with a considered answer.
Okay. And none of the countries that he mentioned they're all within our area of our jurisdiction. Cuba and China weren't mentioned. Is that the reason? Because Cuba and China, I would think, would be at the top of any list.
Oh, sure. I mean, China has the longest history of internet restrictions.
Yeah.
Cuba has significant restrictions. Vietnam has significant restrictions. So if we're looking outside of the OSCE region, there are a number of others we could discuss.
In Turkey, what I'm concerned about, I didn't realize they had this situation. There are 138 words.
Right.
George Carlin would probably know them all.
He only knew 7. He only needed 7.
That's right. How many do you know? And what are they? Translated into English.
The collection of words is each of the words is meant to be the stated intent is to filter out obscene content. But obviously, 138 words would be is a large number of words. And we have serious concerns over it. That, as well as the law that authorizes the takedown of websites that could possibly be implicated in one of 7 or 8 crimes, and the fact that Turkey has blocked over 5,000 websites. There are serious concerns with the condition of internet freedom in Turkey, and of media freedom more generally. I was talking with Dunya before I sat down today, and their latest numbers are that over 70 journalists are imprisoned there. So we have serious concerns, and we'll continue to raise them with the Turkish government.
And are there particular concerns about references to the PKK or to Ataturk?
My understanding is that some politically sensitive topics are political sensitivities is the rationale for blocking certain websites.
So Erdogan is just as concerned about Ataturk as the other party.
Certainly, there have been examples of material that that it involved Ataturk that has been blocked.
Okay. I thank you for your time, and I look forward to your answer on the next 4 or 5 countries. I yield back the remainder of my time.
Dr. Baer, thank you very much for your testimony. If you could get back to us with some of those follow-ups as quickly as possible, including the first 5 and the next 4 or 5, it would be very helpful. Again, it helps us to focus our resources on the most egregious violators, so I do thank you for that. And I do hope as well that your office will look very carefully at the Global Online Freedom Act and hopefully endorse it. I know that it has to go through a lot of checkoffs for that, but you know, it is an idea whose time has come. It would give you the ability to really hold countries to account, and the designation internet restricting country would trigger a number of very important policies towards that country. So I do hope you'll take a good look at that as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm in active and very fruitful conversations with your staff, and will continue to be so.
Dr. Baer, thank you very much, and we really appreciate your leadership.
Thank you.
I'd like to now ask our second panel. Matter of fact, we're going to have to combine panel 2 and 3, a little change of procedure, because we do have a large series of votes that will probably take over an hour and a half to complete on the floor of the House, and I would not want to inconvenience our witnesses more than we probably already will. So let me ask, if I could, start with Dunja Mijatovic, who's the OSCE representative on freedom of the media. She is an expert in media law and regulation. In 1998, is one of the founders of the Communications Regulatory Agency in Bosnia. She helped create a legal, regulatory, and policy framework for the media in a complex post-war society. She also was involved in setting up self-regulatory press council and the first free media helpline in Southeast Europe. Ms. Mijatovic has flown all the way from Vienna to join us at this hearing today. The timing of her appearance is fortuitous, as her office just released a report detailing the legal provisions and practices related to freedom of expression, the free flow of information, and media pluralism on the internet in the OSCE region. Look forward to her testimony. Then we'll be hearing from David Kramer, who's the president of Freedom House and former Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, as well as a former Helsinki commissioner, often sitting right here asking the questions, not giving answers. So I thank him for being here. And without objection, all of your very, very extensive bios will be made a part of the record. Each of you are highly distinguished and have great resumes that speak to a broad range of issues, including the one at hand. We'll then hear from Raphael Rohazinski, Senior Scholar, Canada Center for Global Security Studies and the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto. He was also one of the lead authors of an important report on internet freedom in the OSCE region called Access Control as part of the Open Net Initiative. Next, we'll hear from Ivan Segal, Executive Director of Global Voices, a virtual community of more than 300 bloggers and translators around the world who work together to publish reports from blogs and citizens' media everywhere, with an emphasis on voices that are not ordinarily heard on the international media mainstream. And then we'll hear finally from Charles Li, a Falun Gong practitioner and former Chinese political prisoner who spent from 2000 to 2003 to 2006, I should say, was unjustly incarcerated in the Laogai in China and suffered gross indignities to his person while he was held there. He believes that technology sold by Cisco is violative of the law, has filed a lawsuit against Cisco. He and others have been briefing members on Capitol Hill, including Frank Wolf and many others, about a huge breakthrough in technology that pierces the firewall in China. But he also has spoken out about how China is sharing its worst practices with the OSCE region. So I'd like to now, if I could, begin with Ms. Mijatovic, if you could proceed as you would like.
Thank you, Chairman. Members of Commission, I'm honored to be here again. Actually, the second time since I was appointed. I appreciate this invitation very much, particularly in light of the report that you just mentioned be published, and I would like also to mention that the report was commissioned by my office, but the author of the report is distinguished Professor Yaman Akdeniz from Bilgi University in Istanbul. For centuries, the right to be heard has been seen as the cornerstone of democracy. We can all agree with this. It enables other rights to exist, and in the age of a borderless internet, the protection of a right to freedom of expression, regardless of frontiers, takes on a new and more powerful meaning. The argument for freedom of expression on the web is a double-edged sword, and it's a hotly debated issue nowadays. On one side, it is upholding civil rights, and on the other, allowing governments and censors to question people's own judgments. The internet, as its best, is a cyber experience on every single topic imaginable, from personal pages detailing the life and thoughts of a school child to multinationals promoting their wares online. Governments, however, too many governments, I would dare to say, within the OSCE region, have already begun to impose controls on the internet, threatening the potential of this new medium. As an international community of users and providers of information, we are at a dramatic turning point. The internet will change the way people live. It offers extraordinary opportunities for enhancing creativity and learning, for trading and relating across borders, for safeguarding human rights, for realizing democratic values, and for strengthening pluralism and cultural diversity. The change holds promise, but also holds challenges for all of us. One of the major challenges is to confront ways in which to spread access to the internet so that the whole world can benefit, rather than creating gaps between information rich and information poor. The exploration of cyberspace can be a civilization's truest, most challenging, and also very controversial calling and adventure. The opportunity is now before all of us to empower every person to pursue this opportunity and not to restrict and to suppress free speech. However, the exploration of cyberspace brings both greater opportunity and, in some ways, more difficult challenges than any other previous human adventure. National actions must fit into a pattern of international understanding and the best ways in which to deal with the internet content issues. Just for reminding us, and I will use United States as an example, the internet is the fastest growing medium ever. While it took your country 38 years to reach 50 million radio users, 10 years to reach the same number of television viewers, in only 5 years, in the case of the internet. So we can also see this, how quick we are moving in this adventure. We already live in digital age, a time in which we can create truly democratic cultures with participation by all members of society, and in only a few years from now, this participation will virtually include most of the world's citizens. So despite the progress we see, some challenges and preconditions remain. The first one is surely, as I mentioned at the beginning, access to the internet. Without this basic requirement, without the means to connect, and without an affordable connection, the right to freedom of expression and freedom of the media become meaningless in the online world. The second one is restricting this freedom and restricting free flow of information, which is also one of the basic OSCE commitments. And I would even go so far to say that the free flow of information is, in my view, an oxygen of cyberspace. If we stop it, the internet cannot breathe. It becomes a meaningless tool. Why do certain governments try to block, restrict, and filter this flow? I'm asking myself while doing this job all the time. To protect us from terrorism, child pedophilia, human trafficking, and other forms of threats, and make our societies more secure? All mentioned are legitimate reasons that should not be challenged by anyone. But to protect us from criticism, satire, provocative and shocking comments, differing views, tasteless and sometimes controversial content, for that they do not have our permission. We as a citizens that voted for them never asked or obliged them to shape our minds and opinions. And again, I repeat, in too many OSCE participating states, this is happening on a daily basis. I'm seeing this every day But do I travel, during the time I travel to participating states, talking to the civil society, but also talking to the authorities that are informing me about their attempts to restrict and to suppress further. There is no security without free media and free expression, and no free expression and free media without a security. These two terms should come hand in hand and not fight each other like we see in so many parts of the world. And there is no better place, at least in my modest view, to discuss and fight for both in the OSCE than the OSCE. Security and human rights are both at the heart of Helsinki Act and Astana commemorative declaration, as well as the OSCE principles and commitments that we share. So why do we still struggle? We can also ask ourselves, and why are we so afraid from words, and where does this fear come from? Our common goal, achieving the promises we made, should be a free, open, and safe internet. Very simply, when services are blocked or filtered, users of internet platforms everywhere cannot be served effectively. Today, many governments disrupt the free flow of online information. Popular tactics include incorporating surveillance tools into internet infrastructure, blocking online services, imposing new secretive regulations, and requiring licensing regimes. Since my time is limited, I will finalize my statement without mentioning particular countries, but I'm ready to reply to any of your questions. I have brief recommendation and a comment at the end. I would like to stress once again that blocking access to internet or banning certain content has proven to be totally ineffective. I call it, maybe too bluntly, when I talk to the authorities within the OSCE region, I call it a lost battle. Even by trying to establish regionalized networks, it will not be possible to gain full control over the communication exchanged and information shared on the web. Any attempt to hinder the free flow of information, to disproportionately restrict the right to free expression, to block dissenting opinion, or to prevent critical voices from being heard will prove to be short-sighted, because a free internet and independent media are a means and not an end in itself. Finland and Estonia are countries that should be followed, in my view. They introduced pioneering legislation which established the access to internet as a constitutional right. In France, the Constitutional Court ruled in a similar way, but they have still a long way to go. In order to pay tribute to the unique contribution the internet has given to participatory democracy, to freedom of expression, and to freedom of the media, it is only fitting to enshrine the right to access the internet on exactly that level where such rights belong, as human right with a constitutional rank. Perhaps the time is ripe to turn a new page in the history of fundamental rights and establish access to internet as a universal human right. It would be promising indeed to see the number grow of the OSCE participating states which recognize this principle on a constitutional level. The internet is a fantastic resource that has fundamentally changed our societies for the better. We should not be afraid of it. It will continue to have a positive impact if we allow it. The lesson is simple. The internet must remain free and safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I really appreciate it. We all do, and your work and your report. We do have a series of 16 votes, followed by 2 additional votes. Without objection, all of your prepared testimonies will be made as a part of the record for the hearing record. Technically, we will have to briefly go to a briefing, and Mark Milach and Shelley Hahn, our policy, senior policy advisor and chief of staff, will chair that part. We will try to come back when there's a motion to recommit. We should have about 25 minutes, but there are 16 back-to-back votes. No one can ever predict this, believe me, or else we wouldn't have done this at this particular time. So I apologize for that inconvenience to all of you, and I can assure you that all of us will read your testimonies very, very carefully and react to them, because you provide us a blueprint for going forward, as well as information in terms of where we are right now. So thank you so much. But I will ask Secretary Kramer if he could begin his testimony, and then we will then become a briefing. But all of your testimonies are part of the official record. Secretary Kramer, please.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. It's always a pleasure to appear before you and the Commission. In the interest of time, let me just very quickly say the last time I appeared before you was before an HVAC subcommittee when we were talking about Belarus. And despite the gravity of the situation there and the pressure and attacks that protesters and civil society activists, journalists, and others face on a daily basis in Belarus, I have to tell you, Mr. Chairman, I am more optimistic that that situation is going to change for the better before too long. I think Alexander Lukashenko's days are numbered. He is in the gravest situation he's ever faced, and I don't think he's going to be able to come out of it. So many thanks to you in particular, Mr. Chairman, for your sponsorship and support and leadership on the Belarus Democracy Act that passed the House last week, an extremely important piece of legislation, and very much hope that that will move through the Senate and get the signature of the President very soon. So many thanks for that.
Please share that with Orest as well, because he
I do almost on a daily basis, absolutely. Mr. Chairman, my organization, Freedom House, produced this report, Freedom on the Net 2011, in April of this year. It's a second time we have done this report. And in this report, we looked at 37 countries around the world. And in the OSCE region, we looked at 11 countries. You and your colleagues had asked about some rankings of countries. This is not a comprehensive list of OSCE member states, but I think it does give you some sense of where countries stand. There are some countries that stand out. As Dunya mentioned, Estonia is at the top of the list. The United States is not too far behind. Germany, the UK, and Italy all stand in the free category. We rank countries as to whether they're free, partly free, or not free, and when it comes to Internet freedom. In the partly free category, and this is based on the scores, so I'm going from the best scores down to the lowest scores, would be Georgia, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Russia, Kazakhstan, and then in the very last category of not free would be Belarus, not surprisingly and unfortunately. Mr. Chairman, Freedom House produces this report, but it also engages in activities in promoting Internet freedom across a range of activities and helping with censorship circumvention technologies in countries where the Internet is restricted. We build indigenous capacity to promote and support the use of anti-censorship tools in highly repressive environments, provide technology to developers, and work with international bodies, including with the OSCE. And it's a real privilege for me to be here this morning with the High Representative for Media Freedom in the OSCE region. It is not surprising, I think, that many of these governments that I listed do their best to try to suppress Internet freedom, just as they do with other kinds of freedom and other kinds of media. Belarus, as I indicated, is at the top of the list in trying to crack down on Internet freedom, and the Internet is simply the latest frontier for which Belarusian authorities try to restrict freedom in their country. But Belarus is not alone. A number of the other countries that I mentioned are equally engaged in activities and efforts to crack down on Internet freedom. Some of them just simply haven't kept up with the Internet and communications revolution sufficiently to be able to do so. But I think if we look at their efforts in cracking down on TV and radio and newspapers, it is not a stretch to assume that the Internet is very much on their radar screen and will be the next target of their efforts. It is very important to diffuse the impact of the latest online calls to protest, or rather in an effort to diffuse the online calls to protest in places like Belarus. We see these governments impose restrictive and repressive measures to spam online threads about protests, misuse hashtags, create fake Twitter accounts to undermine actual activists, engage in all kinds of activities. So they're both using the Internet and they're also trying to crack down on it, and I think that's something we very much have to keep in mind. My testimony goes into a number of countries. I already offered you the rankings. I do want to highlight and mention the work that the State Department is doing, including when I was there at the State Department and funding became available to promote Internet freedom. I commend the Obama administration and DRL in particular for the work it's doing in this area. And also, as Dan Baer said, I do want to acknowledge Ian Kelly, our OSCE ambassador in Vienna, for the work he has done and for his outspoken record in stressing the importance of Internet freedom. I think in the interest of time, I will forego going through the details of each of the countries, but in my written testimony, I go into more detail on cases of Belarus and Azerbaijan, Russia, Kazakhstan and Turkey, which are reflected in our Internet Freedom Report. I do also refer to one country that is not reflected in our report, and that is Hungary, in light of the concerns that have been expressed about media law that was passed last year in Hungary and is being implemented this year, and the potential impact that that could have on Internet freedom as well. So with that, let me close there in the interest of yielding time to my fellow panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kramer. As the chairman said right before he left, we are now in briefing mode. We'll continue, and hope that he will be able to return when they're debating a motion to recommit. We will proceed now to Mr. Rohozinski.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank the Commission for the opportunity to appear and testify at today's hearing, which comes at a particularly important moment. The Internet has precipitated perhaps the fastest and largest expansion of rights in human history. And yet, we find ourselves at a constitutive moment where our actions, our leadership, can lead to two opposing outcomes, one of which promises a future of greater freedoms and transparency, the other threatens a return to a darker, more authoritarian past. My name is Rafael Rohozinski. I'm a senior scholar at the Canada Centre for Global Security Studies and CEO of the SecDev Group and Siphon Inc. For the past 10 years, I've been a principal investigator of the OpenNet Initiative, a collaborative international research project between the University of Toronto in Canada, Harvard University, Cambridge University, and the SecDev Group, which has studied and documented the practice and policy of Internet censorship and surveillance worldwide. We've published more than 24 case studies and reports and are currently publishing our third volume that documents censorship practices in over 70 countries worldwide, including all of the members of the OSCE. The OpenNet Initiative has created the largest and most comprehensive profile of how countries seek to shape access to cyberspace through a combination of regulation, repression, and technical means. Now, just over 65 years ago, Winston Churchill warned an American audience of the dangers of an iron curtain falling across Europe, casting a shadow of authoritarianism and depriving citizens of their basic democratic rights. Churchill spoke in 1946 at a time when the United States stood as an uncontested global power. He urged the creation of norms and institutions that would safeguard freedom and actively oppose the forces of authoritarianism. For Churchill, the end of World War II was a constitutive moment when the choices made by the victorious Allies would have enduring consequences for the causes of freedom in Europe and elsewhere. Today, we stand at the threshold of a similar constitutive moment, brought about by a revolution whose long-term consequences we are only now starting to grasp. For the past 2 decades, the emergence of the Internet and cyberspace has led to the largest sustained global expansion of knowledge, rights, and freedoms. Over a third of humanity is connected to the Internet, and there are almost as many cell phones in circulation globally as there are people. Significantly, we are now seeing the coming of age of digital natives, those who have grown up knowing only a connected world. 2/3 of those currently accessing cyberspace are under the age of 25, and over 80% of those use one form of social media or another. But the numbers do not do justice to the social significance of this expansion. So pervasive and all-encompassing is this revolution that it's difficult to see just how fundamentally it's changed the exercise of individual human rights and how much it's added to the cause of basic freedoms and the abilities of all people, no matter how small, to make their voices heard. We need not look any further than the color revolutions in the Commonwealth of Independent States or the Arab Spring to witness the extraordinary power of networked social movements. But the tectonic plates of cyberspace are also shifted. The US, once the heartland of the Internet, makes up approximately 13% of the global Internet-connected population. Europe and the US are approximately 40%. The center of gravity is fast shifting to the south and to the east. The consequences of this shift are direct relevance to today's proceedings. A digital curtain is descending across the globe that threatens to reverse the gains made possible through the emergence of the global commons of cyberspace. Just over half of the world's internet-connected populations live under one form of restriction or another, and that number is fast rising. Since 2003, when we first documented the emergence of the Great Firewall of China, more than 45 states worldwide have adopted similar means for turning the internet from a global commons into a series of gated communities. Eurasia, and in particular the states of the former Soviet Union, are a petri dish of experimentation in the new forms of online repression that deprive citizens of the means to demand transparency from their leaders, accountability from their governments, and the right to seek social and political change. These new forms of restrictions, which document as second and third generation controls, leverage the ability of governments to create restrictive legal environments that attempt to enforce self-censorship through fear of punishment. They also include the application of sophisticated technical means, just-in-time blocking, disrupting access to critical information resources at times when they are most needed, sowing disinformation, and otherwise manipulating information flows. They also include the use of targeted online attacks, denial of service, injecting false content, and sophisticated information operations, and I mean this in the military sense, turned inwards at domestic populations. These controls are pervasive, but also applied selectively, such as during elections, in order to discredit legitimate opposition groups and deprive them of the right to free and unfettered speech. And I say for the record, as someone who operates a circumvention company, that no circumvention technology can effectively combat second and third generation techniques, which are becoming the global norm. In Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Russia, and notably in Belarus, these techniques have been used with great success to silence opposition groups, driving them and their followers offline. In fact, in all post-Soviet states, the internet is subject to one form of control or another. Indeed, the mechanisms for control are getting deeper and more coordinated through regional bodies such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the Collective Security Treaty Organization, as well as bilateral cooperation between governments and their security services. Tragically, perhaps, we are complicit in this growing trend towards authoritarianism. Our own fears of cyber insecurity and terrorism make it easier for others to appropriate these terms to justify political repression. Terrorists can morph into anyone inconveniently opposed to the political status quo, and calls for changing the internet, introducing greater security and the ability to identify users, helpful in tracking down hackers and cyber criminals, find their place in the arsenal of repressive regimes as a means of selectively prosecuting human rights activists, journalists, or anyone seeking to struggle for social and political reform. Our emphasis on harmonizing laws on cybercrime and seeking global solutions to global security, cybersecurity, paradoxically makes it difficult to assert and demand respect for freedom of expression and access to information online. And security is not the only means by which rights can be suppressed. Net neutrality, copyright enforcement, and the empowerment of telecommunications carriers to clean pipes are convenient means for regimes with less than democratic tendencies to offload and outsource policing and ultimately repression. There are no simple solutions to these challenges, only difficult trade-offs. To paraphrase the words of the immortal Pogo, we have met the enemy, and he is at least partially us. So what is to be done? Future historians will look back at this time and see it as a constitutive moment. Before us are some hard choices, but also clear norms and ideals that have been core to the Euro-Atlantic Alliance for the past 50 years, and part of our shared cultural and historical heritage. Leadership comes from the courage to make hard decisions in pursuit of a greater common good. In this respect, a commitment to an open, global commons of cyberspace is by far the most important and far-reaching objective for the U.S. and its like-minded partners in Europe and globally to support. Security is an important obligation of the state, but must be balanced against preserving the right to dissent, communicate, and act online, even if it comes at costs. This is especially true as the new generation of digital natives find their own voice in the online world. New forms of protest, whether they come in the form of making public confidential information, as in the case of WikiLeaks, or the hacktivism as it's been exercised by lulzsex and Anonymous, may be the necessary friction for preserving a global norm that enshrines the right to seek and access information. We must carefully adjust our own laws to make accommodation for some of the new forms of dissent that will emerge. Is there really a difference between picketing an employer during a labor dispute and making his website and internet systems inaccessible through denial of service attacks? These are important questions, and we must pause before we consider how to address them, as the rules that we apply will have repercussions well beyond our borders. In a global world, there is no such thing as a purely domestic policy. In specific terms, at the highest level, this Commission should encourage our European partners to remain committed to a global commons of cyberspace. Calls such as those put forward by some members of the UN to end the multi-stakeholder engagement on governance of cyberspace should be strongly resisted. Pressure should be applied through bilateral agreements, such as well as organizations such as the WTO, to ensure that restricted access to content online is also framed as a trade issue, with consequences and sanctions against countries pursuing these practices. Access to an uncensored internet should become a basic measure of freedom and democratic progress, and made a condition for recipients of preferential U.S. trade relationships or development assistance. Access to political content via the internet should become a central component of monitoring the freedom and fairness of national elections, as important as the right to assembly and balloting. Preserving the global internet commons will not be easy, but the costs of not doing so are greater. The rise of a new superpower in the East is occurring just as the tectonic plates of cyberspace are shifting to the same region. The historic moment in which we live, and which has greatly expanded human expression, quest for knowledge, and an ability to network on a planetary scale, risks becoming a fading chapter in a future where the same technologies enable surveillance societies that far exceed those which George Orwell's 1984 could imagine. The future is ours to lose. And as in those days of March 1946, when Churchill warned us of the Iron Curtain, now is the time for us to courageously make choices so that our constitutive moment, the future of cyberspace, furthers rather than constrains the universal values of dignity, freedom, and right to choose. I thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rosinski. There's a lot to return to in that testimony. I particularly appreciated your image of the digital curtain. Now we'll proceed to Mr. Ivan Siegel.
Good morning. Commission, thank you for the opportunity to address the subject and the topic of online freedom of expression in the OSCE countries. My name is Ivan Siegel. I am the Executive Director of Global Voices, a community of bloggers, writers, and translators from around the world who amplify and analyze the most interesting conversations appearing in citizen media. Global Voices also has a team of writers and analysts who focus on the former Soviet Union, and my testimony today is informed in part by their analysis and their research. So my perspective today is slightly different from the kind of the state and institutional perspective that we've heard thus far in the international organizations. I am trying to channel or represent a diverse set of voices and perspectives that are coming from individuals who are on the cutting edge of the creative process of generating content, news, and information for their own communities in their own contexts. And I think the important thing for me in all of this conversation is to figure out how we can support and emphasize that the work of building and creating networks starts with individuals and citizens in their own communities and is focused primarily on creative capacity. I'd like to look specifically at the question of recent attacks and challenges in the OSCE region, focusing very much on the former Soviet Union. I'd like to say that while attacks have been occurring in this region for quite a few years, those targets have mostly been mass media and more institutional targets. And the change that we've seen recently has been much more of a focus on individuals and social networks. Those targets have fewer resources, less experience, and face a different kind of risk than traditional mass media. A recent example is Belarus, and we've heard a good deal about that today, so I only want to emphasize that that the targets of social media networks themselves are focusing on a different kind of challenge than what we've seen, which is that creative hacking and targeting of individuals that are part of a social media network themselves are not just going after elites and journalists and kind of leaders or representatives of communities, but individuals who are acting in their own interests without necessarily an awareness of the impact that their participation in these social media networks will have. More generally, the mix of tactics of suppression and repression that we see in the OSCE region has a long history, a combination of filtering and hacking of websites, physical threats and intimidation, propaganda and defamation, burdensome legal and regulatory environments, market manipulation, and the use of other legal controls, such as tax inspections, have worked to threaten an earlier generation of content providers online. The targeting of individual websites, online publications, and individual writers through a range of online and offline tactics is also not a new story in the region. The concern is that as the internet access grows across the region, governments will step up their restrictions targeting not just the relatively elite communities, but all citizens writing and sharing content on a range of user-generated platforms. And while the tactics may change, the overall strategy of mixing tools of repression to achieve various ends remains in place. The ultimate goal of this kind of harassing activity seems to be to systematically suppress speech and media content that questions the legitimacy of those in power, and particularly those who question how power and wealth are gained and distributed. It is notable as well that some of these practices are not restricted to non-democratic regimes. Recent mass media laws in Hungary also treat websites as mass media, for instance. I'd like to provide you with a short list of some of the tactics in speech to suppress speech. My testimony goes into them in some detail, so I'll just give you the categories here. Those are legal and regulatory controls, pressure on service providers and intermediaries, extra-legal responses, propaganda, misinformation, disinformation campaigns, and harassment of individuals, and indirect methods that are not directly related to speech, such as violence, destruction of property, arson, physical and psychological pressure. In this context, what can OSCE member states and the US government can do? The document of these abuse tactics is reasonably well established, as reports referenced earlier and throughout the panel today have shown, thanks to activist and freedom of expression watchdog activities. The OSCE should continue to support and promote monitoring and documentation of member states' activities in this sector, both in their own work and in the work of civil society watchdog groups. The deeper question is the willingness of governments to apply the political will to create positive incentives for citizens to participate in public spheres, pursuing both the letter and the spirit of OSCE rights obligations and the Article 19 of the UN Declaration of the Human Rights. These commitments are not just about the economic or scientific benefits of increasing internet penetration, a concept that many FSU countries and governments support, but about the political and civic rights of their citizens. Without politically legitimate and accountable governance, the political will to foster these rights is unlikely to appear. And to be clear, not every government in the former Soviet Union applies restrictions on online speech to the same measure or kind. The picture is varied, with some countries working to meet their obligations. So in my testimony, I think in the interest of time, I won't go through the details of it. In my testimony, I have a set of ideas about how principles, about some principles for removing suppression of speech and discouraging self-censorship in the context of existing laws and legal frameworks within the former Soviet Union. They exist ideas about restrictions on the nature of filtering if it is absolutely necessary. Ideas about the restrictions of the use of hate speech or negative speech laws to suppress broader classes of speech, and ideas such as requirements for independent courts rather than administrative uses for law. I'll leave that to you to read later on. I want to focus for the end of my testimony on the idea of support for generating and creating context for people to participate more positively. There are positive reinforcements that OSCE member states can follow, supporting both the letter and the spirit of their commitments. From the perspective of citizen interest in online environments, this includes a focus not just on access to information, but on the opportunity for online participation, creation, and engagement. Online in networked media environments, speech rights precipitate assembly, movement, and all other rights. Without the medium of speech, other rights are difficult to assert. There has in the past year been an appearance of newly assertive civic voices in several OSCE countries that have poor records on government legitimacy issues such as free and fair elections, corruption, and repressive security regimes. The use of information technology tools and platforms that combine data analysis, visualization tools, mapping, community participation in reporting, and subject-specific expertise point to the creation of projects that are specifically designed to highlight corruption, create transparency, and demand governmental accountability. Examples include a project called Help Map, which allowed Russian citizens to volunteer information and resources to fight fires in the summer of 2010, Roskomzyatka, a crowdsourced map in which Russian citizens can document instances of bribery, and Rospil, which crowdsources independent analyses of Russian government procurements. These projects show the potential that citizens in the former Soviet Union have to find creative solutions to their own problems. Such projects can demonstrate that drivers of change often come from inside repressive environments, and that with greater connectivity, opportunities to participate can create meaningful change. Supporting the continued openness and unfettered nature of the internet provides projects such as these with a firm foundation for the emergence of creative opportunities for people to express their citizenship. And the OSCE role is best articulated in asserting that its members follow the letter and this spirit of their obligations. As far as the U.S. government, its role is best articulated as supporting a continued open nature of the internet as well. But as a first step, the U.S. should consider how its policies of internet freedom will affect local communities that they purport to help. It should follow a do-no-harm approach that is sensitive to local concerns and contexts and takes into consideration the personal security and goals of the online activists working in repressive contexts. In addition to voicing support for access, advocates should consider how to provide multifaceted, diverse tools and resources that help people both to get access to information in restrictive environments, and perhaps more importantly, to help them create, share, and preserve, and build the tools and resources to be engaged as citizens in their countries. The recent U.S. State Department initiatives to support a wide range of tools in education and information access creative content in countries that use extensive filtering is an example of the right kind of approach. Narrowly focusing resources only on information access to external information, on the other hand, downplays the importance of locally generated content. Information tools, technology tools, and the opportunities for communities in repressive environments to strengthen their own content creation. While building tools to help people participate freely online, protect identity and privacy, and participate freely in the exchange of information and knowledge is useful, it is ultimately not a substitute for the application of political will on the part of all OSCE member states to foster legal environments and civic cultures of online participation. To ensure that we protect and grow the internet for citizens first, rather than for security agencies or corporate interests. In this context, the U.S. has the opportunity to lead by example, whether in supporting open governmental data, as with the recent launch of the Open Government Partnership, or supporting internet policy principles that represent the interests of citizens as well as corporations and governments in forums such as the OECD, or ensuring that cybersecurity policies do not impinge on the privacy and rights of its citizens, as with ongoing debates over the extensions of the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act to facilitate surveillance. Finally, governments interested in supporting these commitments should support information access, but also focus on the creative capacity, removing barriers to civic participation. A set of tools to respond to restrictive governments, removing both economic and political barriers is just the beginning. Governments interested in meeting the spirit of OSCE intent can offer many positive incentives to use and support that kind of participation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Siegel. Again, there's a lot to return to there. One thing I would like to return to later, if I forget, please remind me. I think many of us would like to hear more about freedom of expression in Hungary, particularly as it touches on the internet and new laws there. So now we'll turn to Mr. Charles Lee.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Commission. It's my honor and pleasure to be here testifying that what happened in China. When you look at China, actually the communist regime in China is the grandfather of information control. After they took over the power in 1949, they took over all these newspapers and radio, that kind of things at that time. And later on, when the internet came out about 20 years ago, they had a great fear inside the Communist Party, because that was just after the 1989 Tiananmen Square movement, democratic movement crackdown. So they were very afraid of these sentiments inside China. But they knew that because they opened their economy, so they cannot shut down the internet. So they tried their best to develop the internet. In the meantime, the controlling system named the Great Firewall. So the Great Firewall prototype was established in China in 1990s already. But however, the development of this internet censorship was very much tightened and even more sophisticated, and after the crackdown on Falun Gong practitioners. Talking about the Falun Gong, I just want to mention briefly that what is Falun Gong is. It's a ancient Chinese meditation system based upon the principles of truthfulness, compassion, forbearance, and there are also 5 sets of exercises combined by this the principles of this practice and also exercise is so effective. So the Falun Gong practitioners, the number of them increased to almost 100 million at the end of 1998. So the communist regime started to crack down because they did not want to see any group of individuals who can think and do things separate from their system. So they started to crack down on in 1999, and then after that, tens of thousands of practitioners have been persecuted, tortured to death. In the meantime, because they highly control the information, and internet is one of them, the most important one, and also the TV, radio, and the newspapers. They launched a huge campaign against Falun Gong, defaming Falun Gong practitioners, in order to incite hatred against the practitioners. But in the meantime, there are a lot of efforts done by the Falun Gong practitioners, especially in those people in this country. They have formed a global internet freedom consortium combined with the practitioners from the East Coast to West Coast. They have developed a lot of very effective technologies that can be used by people inside China. One of the examples is that Falun Gong practitioners inside China have established about 200,000 material centers. But these material centers, they use these technologies developed by the Falun Gong practitioners outside of the country to get the access to the internet, to websites out of China, and also get the materials. All those materials have been sent out, most of them by practitioners inside China themselves. So they get these materials and then distribute the truth materials to people inside China. And also another issue is that actually for these 200,000 material centers, they support an estimated of 40 million Falun Gong practitioners inside China today, even though the Chinese government spends so much energy and time and money to crack down, but there are still so many people inside China continue to practice and also reveal the truth to the grassroots people in China. Another aspect is that since the end of 2004, there is a book called 9 Commentaries on the Communist Party, was published by the Epoch Times, and since that time, there is a great wave of movement which is focused on quitting the Communist Party membership, and also there are other organizations like Communist Youth League and Communist Pioneers. And the number of these people who have quit these memberships have reached about 98 million just recently. So these numbers tell us how effective this technology are, in terms of piercing the Great Wall, and also for those technologies, Mr. Chris just mentioned that, supported by some of the foreign companies, including Cisco. They have all different technologies, and also another one is called Golden Shield. It's a system of monitoring and filtering the information, monitoring the information communication between different people inside China, so they can track down those people's IP address and find out who those people are and arrest them. So these numbers tell people that it's like ongoing, continuing war between the Chinese Communist regime and also between the Falun Gong practitioners who have been developing these technologies and upgrading this very frequently, so then make sure this technology works. So I just want to say these technologies have also been used by some other countries, like those people in Iran, Egypt, and also other countries like Vietnam, to get the real information, uncensored information. So I think this nowadays, one thing is that the communist regime, they have been developed so many confiscated technologies and have been used by other dictatorial countries as well. But on the other hand, we also see hope that people are working on this to piercing these great firewalls and also those golden shield systems. So it is important to raise the awareness of this ongoing war between this censorship and also these efforts to piercing this censorship. And we should support more on these people who can really bring this technology to bring the information to the free information to people in those countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charles. I hope we can return to some of the themes you raised, particularly including the effect that China may have on degrading internet freedom standards in the OSCE. As the chairman said before he went to vote, Shelley Han and I will proceed to ask questions regarding your testimony, just as if we were in the hearing while we wait for the chairman to return. Ms. Han, I should say, is on the staff of the Helsinki Commission. She is working on internet freedom legislation for the chairman, and she organized this hearing. I will begin with a question, and then we'll turn over to Shelley, and we'll go back and forth. The question I wanted to start off with, and this is perhaps more for David Kramer and Mr. Rohozinski, though of course all are welcome, is it correct to see in the OSCE, we've talked about China here, is it correct to see China as the instigator or as the motivating force, inspiration, provider of technology, provider of techniques and apparatuses to countries that are restricting internet freedom? Or is it do we tend to exaggerate that? Is there some other driver perhaps within the OSCE? Would there be within the OSCE a country that plays the role that we often attribute to China of spreading or providing technologies of repression? I'm wondering about Russia and Kazakhstan, but it could be another country. Please.
I would China is an accomplice to it, I would say, in providing technology and know-how. But the motivating factor is insecure, paranoid, authoritarian regimes in the OSCE. They are the ones who are driving efforts to crack down on internet freedom, just as they're responsible for suppressing other kinds of freedom. And what we see are these regimes cooperating with each other. In fact, they do a much better job of collaborating, cooperating with each other, sharing technology, sharing, if you'll allow the expression, best practices, at least for what they do, than we do in the democratic community of nations in terms of sharing information and technology and coming together to push back on these challenges that are posed by authoritarian regimes. If we had included all of Central Asia in our survey, we would have seen Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, as one of my colleagues had mentioned, also in the not free category when it comes to internet freedom. And some of these regimes do rely on outside players, such as China, to help them in suppressing internet freedom in their countries. But I think, to be clear, the driving force is the regimes themselves, who do not want to see freedom, whether it's on the internet or anywhere else in their societies.
Thank you.
Well, I would add to that, I think, maybe something which is a basic fact, and that is that the OSCE region, countries within that region, also belong to other regional blocs. For example, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the CSTO. Within those organizations, certainly there is collaboration between security forces and security interests around shared agendas. Whether that translates into technical assistance, I think, is a fairly far stretch at this point in time. We certainly have not seen in any of the former Soviet states the adoption of identical technologies such as are used for securing the Great Firewall of China. It really doesn't happen. We see instead a lot more just-in-time approaches to filtering and blocking, which are built around the specific political agendas of the regimes at stake, and generally applied at times when those regimes feel it is necessary to tamp down on inconvenient opposition movements. Certainly, China plays a role in terms of supplying technology that builds the physical layer of the internet, and certainly Chinese operators, particularly in Central Asia, have been vying with Russian telecom operators in terms of becoming the carriers of internet traffic for those countries in the region. In fact, when we did a study in Uzbekistan several years ago and compared the censorship regimes on several of the internet service providers, we found that there was an inconsistency between those that chose to buy their internet services through Russian providers and those who used China Telecom, where China Telecom's censorship regime had effectively been exported to this particular Central Asian country. So at the physical layer, obviously Huawei is a major provider of equipment. And since Huawei also operates in Western markets, all of their equipment conforms to CALEA standards, which essentially means it has the same technologies and protocols built in to give lawful access to interception of internet technologies, as does anybody else. By that measure, we can say that Chinese technology is used to secure censorship means in post-former states. But whether that's a direct transfer of technology or something which is inherently built into the standards of technologies that we all use, I think is a more accurate way of putting it. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Talk about little things about, actually, besides the technical aspects, is that these countries in OSCE region, most of them are former communist countries, even though they're not right now, but there are still elements of, from the previous communist parties, the mentality things. And I think it's important to realize the movement I just talked about, the quitting the Communist Party in China. This is like a decommunization of people's mind and behavior. So this is, I think, is like a broader, angle to look at these things, and it will truly improve this free information efforts, so for people to realize what is truth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles, or Mr. Lee. We'll go back a little ways. Sally?
Ms. Mijatovic, I wanted to ask you, your report that you issued last week provides a really important baseline for where we are in the OSCE region in terms of internet content regulation. And I'm wondering where you see your work going forward on this issue. What kind of support do you need from participating states? And how receptive are what we would call, without naming, but the problem countries, how receptive are they to efforts from your office or other parts of the OSCE or even bilaterally to changing some of the regimes that they have right now?
Thank you. Well, the report is, in a way, a step forward in the process of reminding governments of 56 about their commitments, and as you rightly pointed out in headline, promises our heads of state made on so many occasions in relation to the free flow of information. It doesn't change, offline or online. The situation within the region and beyond, of course, we cannot ignore it, is not rosy. The attempts of the governments to further restrict, suppress are visible, almost without any shame. This is done in a process of stopping and silencing the voices. Sometimes we see kind of sophisticated way of suppressing free speech, but in the cases we see more and more, and colleagues today and then mentioned several countries where we see the problems, which is now increasing, particularly in relation to the Facebook activists, social media. So that is seen by, and I would dare to say, unstable governments as another threat in a process of establishing more and more borders. And I really liked what Rafal said about digital curtain. What they are trying to do, they are trying to build a curtain within their own countries. But again, and I would repeat myself, once again, it's a lost battle, because in the offline world, history taught us that no matter how much the regimes try to suppress free speech or human rights in general, people will always find ways to reach for those rights. It's not an easy task. It's not an easy job for my office and for the mandate that I have. I must say that the cooperation is there, but sometimes I have a feeling that some of the documents, some of the most important documents we have within the OSCE are just empty words on paper, because they are not complied with, they are not honored, and they are not implemented. My job in this process is to remind the governments, but today we also heard from a distinguished commissioner at the beginning, do we need a hammer? I do not think so, because all the tools that the OSCE has as a disposal because of comprehensive and consensus-based nature, all those tools are of democratic nature. And those are the only tools we use in this process in order to build more trust. It's not something that happens overnight, but the cooperation is there. There is a more need for coordinated approach by different international organizations in order to make changes. Belarus was mentioned on so many occasions. The only thing we can do is to continue raising our voices and trying to change the situation there, and to help people that are really suffering tremendously just because they have differing views or they try to express their opinion. Also the countries that were mentioned, and they are all the time on the very top of my agenda, Hungary, you mentioned, is of a great concern for my office. I raised this issue first time in June 2009, and we are at the moment monitoring the situation there in order to see in which direction this will go. You also ask what are the ways we can help and we can change the situation. We can offer legal analysis of a certain laws, articles we send with recommendations to the government. We did it in a case of Hungary. Unfortunately, the recommendations and everything that was put forward was not accepted as valid for certain changes, but we do continue dialogue because that's the only way, and from a Hungarian government side there is cooperation in a way that they do listen, but unfortunately still there are no changes, even though I do expect that those changes we will start working on it soon. Turkey as well, it was mentioned, and I think it's important in this because we mentioned several Central Asian countries and post-communist countries. Turkey is in a way, very particular case. We have two issues that are burning, imprisonment and internet freedom. But I think that would deserve a longer time in order to explain it. We do work with the Turkish government very openly. I'm invited by the authorities for the first visit since I was appointed in September. I welcome this step forward very much, and I do hope that we will come up to some conclusions which will change the internet law that in a way needs to change if we want to see any positive movements. But at the moment, the situation doesn't look very promising.
Ms. Mijatovic, could you characterize the Hungarian law and how it affects internet freedom so that we all have an idea?
Well, it's almost impossible at this occasion because the law, it's one of the, it's thousands and thousands of pages that were adopted overnight. No public consultations. It is very much related to the whole media package. So it's not just the internet freedom. We heard that there were many issues mentioned today, but in relation to internet, particularly internet is seen as just another media that needs to be regulated in the old traditional way. Media Council, Media Authority, which is a regulatory authority, is composed of members with mandate of 9 years renewable, which is not seen in any of the EU member states. They have full power to regulate electronic media, internet, and press, which is also something that is not seen in within the EU member states legislation. Internet is chapter that we also analyzed, and we offered the analysis to Hungarian government in order to change the law before it was adopted. But as I said, that was not accepted. And the only changes that were made were changes, I would call them of a cosmetic nature, that were made were changes in relation to the request from a European Commission that were related to different issues than the internet freedom.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's very tempting to ask each of you now to rate the 5 worst countries in the OSCE region, but I think we've brought that out already, and Freedom House has in a way been working on that and done that for us. So I'll ask another question here. Can you give me an idea how the technologies used in internet repression are changing? In 2006, we tended to think of internet repression generally in terms of blocking sites and putting surveillance on users. I have this sense, but don't know exactly that in fact now there are a lot more things going on, and while blocking and surveilling are still issues, they're no longer 80% of the game or 60% of the game, but are becoming are diminishing in their relative importance as many other nefarious tricks and devices have come into play. Can any of you, all of you, elaborate on that or respond?
Permit me to make the first remark. I think there's an essential fact here that has to be recognized, and that is that the technologies that are used for limiting access to information or targeting and identifying individuals are the very same technologies that we have demanded to be built into the internet in order to tackle the problem of cybercrime, cyber espionage, and cyber insecurity. In fact, some of the most significant technological changes which will transform the internet are being brought about by our concern of securing our national networks from these parasitic and ultimately what we see as negative occurrences. Now, that having been said, it's also quite clear that regimes have become well-versed in the art of information operations. That is, how to create, shape, and influence actors on the net using a variety of different tools, including legal tools, including tools that effectively try to drive opposition movements out by flooding their dialogue with a counter discourse that effectively confuses users, by using shaping through the turning on and off of different parts of networks available on a national level in order to sow doubt, sow fear that technologies don't work or that are in effect working against the very activists that are using them. That, I would say, is one of the fundamental trends which we have laid out as second and third generation filtering, and ones which, as I say, are being propelled by our own concerns about securing cyberspace from cybercrime and cyber espionage. Now, I agree with my colleague from the OSCE that in some respects it is human agency, the willingness of people to put themselves at risk, that ultimately drives social change and not net technologies. But it's also undeniable that these technologies have made the work of activists and others who care about their communities much easier, much quicker, and much less bloodless. I fear that as cyberspace becomes closed down as an environment, as a domain for legitimate political action, we will be moving from the relatively bloodless jaw of activists to the war of rebellion. And I, for one, would much rather live in a world where the revolution can be tweeted than when it's belched from the barrel of an AK-47.
Thank you. Others? Shelley?
We've mentioned a couple of times the concept of a regional or national internet as a way for countries to control information. Recently, Google blogged on their blog about Kazakhstan's request to them to only route information through google.kz, which would mean that, in effect, they would be creating almost their own national internet. And Google demurred and asked that, to reconsider that. And I think that they were somewhat successful. But there are still, I think future domain names that are added to google.kz will still come under this restriction. So can we talk a little bit about the technology behind that? How does that work versus blocking? And is that sort of the future for countries? I think Cuba basically already has something similar to that. But is that the future for countries that want to sort of take themselves off what we would consider the global internet and then create their own version? And how does that work, and why should we be afraid of that?
Well, let me take that question. The latest, and I think the headline-grabbing aspects of Kazakhstan wishing to use control of its top-level country domain as a means of creating a national intranet is actually a bit of an old story. Effectively, in Tajikistan and Kazakhstan, national intranets based upon an internet which is accessible only within the top-level country domain has existed for at least the last 3 or 4 years. In fact, I would say that this is one of the emerging forms of censorship where economic discrimination or economic means are used as a way of effectively creating a two-speed internet for citizens of these countries. So the way that it's worked in Tajikistan and Kazakhstan previously is there was a different tariff put against someone who wanted to access the internet that was restricted to domains existing within .tm or .kz, and those that gave access to domains outside of that. The difference now that's being made is that that kind of virtual bubble built around tariffs and access to domains are starting to be applied to services which exist on a more planetary level like Google. We fully anticipate that both the repatriation by most states in the region, and in fact globally, of top-level domains, which effectively gives them control over the domain name system within their countries, combined with requests to, for example, register international media carriers as local media, making them subject to media laws, are the emerging front leading edge of what we will see as control regimes that exist. We are already starting to see similar kind of efforts, for example, being put in place in Iran. the creation of a national intranet, again, which segments itself from the global intranet. And we fully anticipate that economic, i.e. tariff means, are going to be as effective in creating and making that an effective means for containing populations, as will any physical means put over trying to restrict access to the global internet. And again, I would say that that is one of the issues in terms of what Department of State, U.S. government should be looking at in terms of addressing the problem of keeping the open internet commons. That simply funding circumvention technologies is not enough. It's going to take a lot of policy work to crack this particular nut. Thank you.
But before I let other people comment, how exactly would the State Department address that? You know, because it seems that now, because of the way the internet governance is established now, there is no government mechanism for doing that, unless I'm mistaken. But I'm just curious if you had some thoughts on how to address that.
No, that's very true. One of the benefits of the way that internet governance has worked up to now is the fact that it's diffuse and multipolar and controlled by a variety of different actors, including commercial, private, self-governing, self-constituting bodies. What has happened, and which is a trend outside of the OSCE as an organization, OECD as an organization, basically those which conform to our, let's say, similar normative characteristics, is that you are seeing regional bodies start to look at the issue of internet governance as a strategic priority, harmonize amongst themselves, such as, for example, within the SCO, use and leverage international organizations as a way of shifting and centralizing internet governance into organizations that are collective, international, and subject to majority vote. So the danger is that because the simple majority exists, there is a danger that, in effect, those rules will start to be changed. And I think it's extremely important for both the OSCE, at least in terms of its members from Europe and the Euro-Atlantic Alliance, and certainly the US in terms of its international engagement, to realize that strategic lobbying and building a coalition of the willing around a concept of a free, open, global internet commons is extremely important as an idea to push, cultivate, and support. Thank you.
I want to comment on the situation in China. Actually, the Chinese government has been tempted to build a national internet for a long time, but because China's economy is so heavily relied on the foreign trade, and there are a lot of foreign business in China, so if they did that, there would be a disaster for the economy. So they couldn't. So they're trying to tailor in, if they could build up a national internet for the Chinese people or something like that. But it's very difficult. So I don't see this in the near future that can happen. Thank you.
I'd like to ask a question of Mr. Rohozinski and also Mr. Lee. And of course, again, to anybody who's interested in commenting, but it'd be very helpful if someone could explain the difference between the notion of second generation technologies in fighting internet restrictions or the second generation of internet restriction technologies and how that's changed from what we were dealing with about 5 or 6 years ago. And related to that, I'd like to hear people's opinions on firewall busting technologies or circumvention technologies versus other means other technical means of promoting freedom on the internet. I guess we start off with Charles.
I think this is like as I mentioned, it's ongoing war because this internet censorship technology, they constantly upgrading, and also the people in this country, I mean Falun Gong practitioners, they also have upgrading these technologies constantly. So I don't have any clear answer for this generations per se, because myself is not a technical person. But I want to add that the way of control the internet is there's a lot of ways for the communist regime. One of these very interesting thing in China is that they have hired millions of people, who are unemployed to post their comments in the internet to trying to mislead people's opinion. This is one of those things they do. Just on the side of the technical question, they pay those people like 50 Chinese cents per post they do. So which is very little money for them. They how they use these resources in China to control the internet contents. Thank you.
So this is outlined actually in the written testimony that's been submitted to the Commission, but I'll restate it here in simpler terms just so we can have criteria for it.
Please.
So first generation filtering essentially relies upon lists that enumerate sites or content that should be blocked and creates a firewall or a physical barrier that simply does not let that through. Now this takes on various technical characteristics, but ultimately what it means is that you are creating a wall that stops certain content from being accessed. It exists all the time, it is constantly upgraded, it effectively enumerates as you go along, and in some cases has become much more anticipatory in terms of what content should be blocked. This is what we refer to as the Great Firewall of China. There are very few countries in the world that practice the Great Firewall in China type approach, and in fact, the number of countries practicing that particular approach is falling.
So I take it that no OSCE countries.
OSCE countries, we see Uzbekistan, we see Turkmenistan certainly using those kinds of technologies, where there's a constant block list constantly applied. We're starting to see selective blocking on a much lower level in places like Kazakhstan and elsewhere. However, the vast majority of what we're now starting to see as online censorship are what we call second-generation techniques. These may apply the same kind of blocking, but it doesn't do it consistently and doesn't do it over time. What it does instead is applies them when those sites or when that information is most needed. So for example, in 2006 during the Belarus elections, selected sites were blocked, but only for a 3-week period. Other than that, they were available. Other second-generation techniques include more active measures taken to shut down sites. Rather than to filter them, they are attacked through denial-of-service attacks, essentially rendering them inaccessible to anybody on a planetary level. There are also hacking attacks, which deliberately manipulate or change the content on those sites themselves. Some of them are quite crude, simply defacing or bringing down the site. Some of them, such as we have seen in Kazakhstan, can be quite elaborate, where in effect what happens is content is injected into a legitimate site, only changing small aspects of it, rather than entirely blocking the site or entirely changing or defacing the site in a way that it's not effective. Secondly, second-generation techniques also include the use of surveillance and selective prosecution and the designing of laws that create harsh barriers for someone wishing to either use certain technologies or access certain information, effectively criminalizing it or creating high-level fines that cow people, creating fear and doubt in actually wanting to go outside of those. Third-generation techniques take it a step further. Those include, for example, the use of malware, computer virus-based attacks against human rights groups, opposition groups, and others in order to pollute their information flows, disrupt their communications, effectively turn members of the organizations against each other if possible. They include the use, as Charles said, of 50-cent armies, effectively hiring large numbers of counter-bloggers who engage opponents in an online dialogue or simply overwhelm their information flows through the creation of alternative information. Now,
do any OSCE countries do this?
Yes, we've seen this very effectively used in Belarus. We've seen this used during the Russian elections. In fact, we see this used in just about every OSCE country east of the Elbe. Denial-of-service attacks are used constantly against independent media, opposition parties, or in effect, a lot of very inconvenient information that exists even out there in the wild that may be specific to any one politician. In fact, a few years ago, if you had opened a Russian online newspaper, you would have openly seen adverts where people would hire out botnets to carry out denial-of-service attacks against anyone who had the money to pay them the $200 or so to carry these things out. We obviously saw denial-of-service attacks being used very effectively in 2007 against Estonia, and later in the Russia-Georgia war as well. Now, what I would point out, and I would put my cards on the table, as an operator of a circumvention technology, is that dealing with second and third generation type attacks is extremely challenging. And none of the tools that have been created, either by our colleagues at the Falun Gong or anywhere else, can effectively get a site back up, circumvention tools, when it comes under denial of service attack, or encourage people to use online tools where they may fear doing so because of prosecution, or defend them against malware-based surveillance or other kinds of techniques that are being used. So these are hard challenges which don't have solutions in the purely technological realm.
This is very discouraging. I'm getting a picture here of an increasingly broad arsenal of the repressive governments. Ms. Mijatovic?
Just a brief comment. Within the OSCE region, unfortunately, you don't need to be very technologically advanced in order to see how the internet freedom is suppressed on a daily basis. You do not need second or third generations. You just need a young Facebook activist who has a differing view and who is the next day arrested on dubious charges and put in prison for it. So those are also the ways of, in a way, very basic ways of suppression and restriction. In Azerbaijan, 2 young bloggers were in a prison for almost 2 years because they just put a video clip on their website that was critical of the government. They are finally outside the prison, but there was no need for the government to use any advanced technological means in order to put them in prison and to have this enormous chilling effect that is continuing in Azerbaijan, because now there are 2 more Facebook activists in a prison just because of differing views, again, on dubious charges. And when I write to the governments, what I hear from them that it's absolutely nothing to do with freedom of expression, it's because of drug dealing. That's mostly the case that it's used, drug dealing or hooliganism, as an explanation of suppressing people's rights to express their views on a Facebook. And that is becoming more and more problematic, especially in Central Asia, because it's seen, especially after African Spring, as another threat to the government's, in a way, will to suppress any critical voices in their countries. So just the point was that you do not need advanced technology in order to continue this agony, in a way, of trying to suppress people's voices.
Point taken. Mr. Siegel?
I'd just like to point out that this trend, and we're talking about it as if it's new, but in many countries in the former Soviet Union, this is something that's been occurring for 15 years. And if there are additional tools in the arsenal of repressive regimes today, it does not diminish the basic strategy that they've employed for a long time, which has always been a mix of tactics designed to intimidate, to restrict, to suppress, to propagandize, to create disinformation or misinformation around a particular set of ideas. If in 1996 the response of the way to take out an independent newspaper in Kazakhstan was to throw a firebomb into a printing press, today there's a similar mechanism. And I think we shouldn't be discussing this issue as if there's some kind of essential change in the approach that we see here. There were websites that were altered, hacked and altered around, opposition websites that were hacked and altered in Kazakhstan 10 years ago. So that second generation technology that Mr. Harzinski is speaking of has been occurring in Kazakhstan for 10 years. So it is again, the intent is to focus on internal voices that have an effect not just of receiving information and listening passively, but are actively trying to produce content, information, or create voice that are a threat to the legitimacy or threaten the authority of regimes around very specific issues. And security ministries in many of the countries we've been discussing have active strategies about how to combat or pinpoint those kinds of issues. And I think that's the proper framework for understanding the problem.
Thank you. Mr. Kramer.
Could I just quickly add, picking up on some of what's been said, it is important to recognize, I think, that the technology can have a negative impact on the state of human rights and freedom in the world, and certainly in the OSCE region. The OSCE is no exception. In the recommendations and the testimony I've submitted, I suggest that companies conduct transparent human rights impact assessments so that they determine how American-made technology might adversely affect the privacy of citizens in the OSCE region that could severely restrict freedom. And in light of the European Parliament's passing an export control regime of products that have a negative impact on the internet freedom, I would suggest that the Congress also look at the possibility of such a regime. And then in picking up on a point that Raphael had made in going through the different generations of technology that these regimes use, is critically important, is busting through the firewalls, is there are other anti-censorship technologies and assistance and advice that can be provided, and those include training so that activists are aware of and recognize the threats that are being posed. They reduce their vulnerabilities, security so that they have the support necessary to fight against the various cybersecurity threats that they face on a daily basis, and then thinking about urgent response mechanisms so that if in urgent need they have places that they can go and networks that they can rely on. Thank you.
Thank you. Sean.
One more question. Mr. Segal, I wanted to ask, and I'd like others to chime in if you'd like to, but really what is the role for citizens? I mean, Global Voices is a forum for users in a lot of different countries, but how should citizens be working? You know, we're focusing here on government policies and what governments are doing, but you know, I'd like to look at talk a little bit more about what private companies, the technology companies that are expanding the either the social media or the infrastructure itself. What should be their role? But then also, what about users? Ethan Zuckerman famously coined the cute cat theory of you know, sort of harnessing the number of users and the interest in the internet for watching cute cat videos. How do you then translate that into users who are really how should I say this? They're interested in how they're getting their information and what information they're getting. You know, how do we make that leap from people who just randomly want to go on and watch YouTube videos to people who actually care about how their government is controlling or blocking their internet? Wondered if you had any thoughts on that and others as well.
Well, the fundamental structure of online communities in a networked media society is webs or circles of individuals who have multiple links through their communities that are focused around common interest, if you're talking about citizen media space. So if, for instance, a very simple example, if I have a blog and I write about cats, and I will put a list of links within my blog to other people who also write about cats, that constitutes a community. Once a community is formed, it continues to focus on its subject or its issue, but it has become potentially an active space for other contexts, other conversations. If we look, broadly speaking, at the way that online communities have moved in regard to, say, Arab Spring movements, we see that the function of the internet is very much an accelerator. It is very useful at bringing together a cross of categories, that is, people who like cats, and networks, that is, people who are involved in happen to live, for instance, in the same physical space. And there's a sociological theory around this. It's called cat nets, which is not the same theory as the cute cat theory. On the internet, it becomes much easier to raise a flag, such as an an image or a concept or an idea and rally people around that idea. And the formation of those groups is much more rapid. Whether or not that leads to some kind of actual social change is a different question. But if we look in Egypt, for instance, at the We Are All Khaled Said movement, we see a simple event, which is difficult, but an event which is the arrest and then eventually the killing of an individual that served as a flag and like a concept around which people could rally. As a social movement, it is not different necessarily from earlier kinds of social movements, except in terms of its accelerating potential. And when we follow how social movements track, not just nationally, but around the world, we see that the potential for communities to gather quickly around a concept, rather than around an individual, are greatly enhanced. And one way of thinking about it is that we should be thinking about how ideas move through people and networks rather than finding or focusing specifically on charismatic leadership or on traditional hierarchies of organizing in opposition movements, which is not to say that organization is not important. I think anybody who works in the digital media activism space would say that you still have to organize people if you want to get them onto the street. It's not a technological determinism to say that these are tools that are effective in creating and driving change. It's more the point that there's a different kind of organization, and if you're thinking about how communities do organize, it's a matter of choosing the right tool and the right tactic for the event. So in Tunisia, Facebook was really important, and it was important because so many other user-generated content services and blogs were blocked, but the private networks within Tunisia were able to focus on work in the Facebook space. But that didn't reach a large audience. It reached a very narrow audience. For them to be effective, they had to be translated, taken out of the Facebook community, put into blogs, put into other contexts, and then ultimately broadcast by Al Jazeera. And then they were effective at a national scale.
I'd just like to comment on something that Ivan said, because I think it's a very essential point here. The character of opposition movements, how they coalesce, how citizenry can, in effect, mobilize itself for social change, has been transformed by society, by technology. You know, whereas previously movements required long gestation periods, different organizational structures, now it is possible to create a revolution essentially because of the means of being able to bridge commonality of interests and create an emotive spirit to get out on the streets and carry out social change in ways that simply isn't possible when you have an organization that's dependent on leadership. You can have leaderless resistance. However, and I think this is an important point, just to come back to something that you had mentioned as one of your questions, I certainly don't want to leave the impression here that circumvention tools or technologies are not important to be supported in their own right. I think they're essentially a very important tactical tool for promoting openness and the possibility of social change. They're not a substitute for a strategy, and I think that's where in the past debates have unfortunately fallen into, that somehow we can design something that will meet our objectives or create our objectives. Let's not forget, fax machines did not lead to the Polish Revolution. Solidarity did. Much in the same way, it'll be the work of the Falun Gong or concerned Chinese citizenry that will affect social change, and not Tor, not GIFC, or not Siphon. Thank you.
I'd like to switch gears for a moment here. Just as most of you or all of you represent groups that are about change, that the Helsinki Commission is also about change, and it's of course very helpful to get your assessment of the situation and the problem. I'd like to talk about what we can do going forward. My first question would be for Ms. Mijatovic. The Helsinki Commission, of course, was created to interact with the OSCE. Do you have any suggestions on what the Commission and congressmen who are interested in the OSCE can do to promote the Internet freedom agenda, to promote freedom on the Internet within that organization? What kinds of things, and you can be very particular, very specific, would be helpful to move this issue onto the agenda in an effective way within that group?
Thank you for this question. It's very relevant, and I would also like to use this opportunity firstly to thank the Commission for a constant interest and involvement in the work of my office and a support, which in a way presents an enormous energy that is given to us when we see that participating states through their commissions and different other bodies are trying to engage more in all the issues that we are discussing in order to promote and to implement the commitments. What can be done in order to enhance this cooperation and in order to make those states that are not actually honoring the commitments? I think what we have as a problem in certain regions, but in certain countries of the OSCE region is something that is almost in a modern digital world, something that is even not understood well. It is the problem of telecommunication infrastructure, a very low level of penetration of the internet, and ultimately lack of internet literacy, education. So I think in a way, in order to promote freedom, there is more need to continue talking about it on a different levels and in different countries. Because I always said in my work, it is almost impossible to do anything from Vienna. In order to change things, you need to go to certain countries in order to promote the commitments and in order to engage with civil society and with the authorities. Sometimes it's a struggle, but in this process, the Commission and all other bodies that are interested in working with the office can do more on promoting trainings and education in certain regions of the OSCE, so we can move to a different level when we talk to people and we try to help them. Because some of the issues that we tackle today in some of the countries would be almost impossible for people to understand in order to know their rights. So in those countries it's very easy to manipulate people's minds and their decision-making process because they do not know enough. For different reasons. Maybe it's a legacy from the old systems, as we heard before, but maybe also the restriction of information that is seen as a tool of suppressing their views, not to mention any critical views. So the chilling effect is another thing that we see as a huge problem. I do not have a formula how to tackle. I do not have a formula how to tell Commission in order to engage in this process. But I think what we have already, the cooperation with NGOs and different other organizations in order to promote internet freedom and to actually explain what does it mean and why it is so important. So it's not seen as some kind of monster behind a closed door that is going to destroy, as I hear on many occasions, tradition, culture, and sensitivities of a certain societies, which is not a case. So I would just encourage you to do more and more of hearings of this kind in order for us to be able to talk to the audience, but also to engage in the projects that would promote internet literacy within the OSCE region.
If I could follow up, because I have a very closely related second question, and that is, if the first one was about how the Commission can interact with the OSCE to move this issue forward, what about what Congress can do to move this issue forward in the OSCE and in the broader world? I think I've already mentioned that the chairman is working on legislation on internet freedom. Be very interesting to hear from each one of you your thoughts on the traps that legislation that it could fall into, the directions we should go, your thoughts and reflections on emphasis, the success or failures of previous iterations of internet freedom legislation, and you know, how the issue is changing and how we need to be changing our thinking about it in order to, as I say, promote change. We're about change.
Well, if I may, I said at the end of my statement that one of humble suggestions of mine would be to make an internet a human right, like, for example, Estonia or Finland did. So I think if more and more countries would engage in making it human right and enshrine it in their constitution, that would probably bring long-term changes in people's mind on how important it is to have access to internet. On a more practical level, I think Dan mentioned it during his testimony. This year, towards the end, we will have a ministerial conference in Vilnius, and Lithuanian chairmanship made freedom of the media and freedom of the internet, of course, as one of their priorities. I know that the chairmanship is aiming to adopt a ministerial decision in relation to internet freedom, and the support from a commission and a Congress and the US government in this particular issue would make a great impact and great change in order to make this happen, because I think it would be, in a way, not a new commitment, but rolling over what we have already into a new reality, which is internet reality. And it would present a political view on the importance of the internet freedom within the OSCE region. And I do hope that the 56 will have enough courage and wisdom to adopt such an important decision at the end of the year. So, you know, we will be open. My office, of course, doesn't play a role in a decision-making process, but we would assist and help as much as we can, because I think for internet users and for citizens within the OSCE region, this would present an enormous step forward.
Thank you very much. 56, that is the tough part, the 56 member states. David?
Just very quickly, 3 points. One, the Commission, members of Congress, really can't stress enough the importance of open access to the internet, that this is, as Dunya had said, this is a fundamental freedom. It's a freedom of expression. Having hearings like this, having hearings specific about certain countries and abuses that governments are responsible for, I think is very worthwhile. Second is to call out member states that are not complying with these fundamental freedoms. Naming and shaming. It is tough to do in an organization that is based on consensus, but some member states have to stand up and take a principled position when there are such abuses taking place and trotting on fundamental freedoms. The third point is to support, in the strongest way possible, the Office of the Representative for Freedom in the Media. It's critical. It's not an easy job. And it deserves full support from members of Congress, from the Commission, and from the U.S. government. Thank you.
Please.
A quick note on this, and thank you very much. David, you said it, so I didn't have to say it myself, but its support is there, and it's extremely important to have this support, because it gives more energy and more courage for us fighting for free speech around the world. But I think we are criticizing a lot 56, but I think also this is a good moment to remember that the office was created by 56. And the office is the only intergovernmental media watchdog in the world. It is unique, and I think this uniqueness and in a way the beauty of the mandate is that the 56 created an institution to name them, shame them, and blame them for not complying with what they agreed on a voluntary basis. So that's actually my job. It's not an easy one. It's a very sensitive and very responsible task, but I do not hesitate to explore the mandate and in a way to bend it and stretch it when there is a need to remind the participating states. But if there are more voices joining from the NGO side and from the authority side, of course, the impact and the results are much greater.
That's a very true observation. Pardon my flash of cynicism on the number 56. Please, Mr. Hozinski.
Well, as a Canadian citizen, I find myself in a funny situation of being asked to advise the U.S. Congress when my own Parliament has yet to hold a single hearing on this particular issue. That having been said, let me summarize a few points as takeaways. One, I think it's really all about leadership and moral courage. We have to recognize the centrality of cyberspace to everything that we do. There is no separation between domestic policy in terms of how we choose internally to regulate the internet or provide means for providers in the U.S. and how those means will be interpreted and used, whether in the OSCE or globally. Along with that comes a very important task of recognizing cyberspace as a global commons, a global commonwealth that requires a joint stewardship. It's not simply about the internet. It's not simply about a domain. It's about something which we collectively have to tend to as a global society in order to ensure that those flickers of freedom that have emerged over the last 2 decades globally continue to burn rather than to wink out into a new era of darkness. 3, we need to recognize that there is a basic contradiction between the way we are currently addressing the insecurity, cyber security, and the militarization of cyberspace and some of the values and principles that this panel has raised. There is a cost to maintaining an accessible and open internet, and that may mean being able to absorb the friction of the inconvenience of groups like WikiLeaks, which put our secrets out for everyone to see, and provide transparency, which is perhaps slightly more radical than most commercial and public bodies are willing to see. 4, in terms of addressing the hammer that one of the members of the Commission raised, access to content, access to information should be raised as a trade issue, as one on limitation of trade. I think that's an avenue for combating censorship, which has not been fully exploited by anyone, and where the U.S. has a unique position as a major trading partner to actually exert some authority. 5th, governance. We must preserve the multi-stakeholder approach to internet governance. That means ensuring that the centralization of governance is not concentrated in institutions, where values through simple majority vote may shift it into a direction which is inimical to the principles of freedom and choice that we have enshrined and that we all support. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Segal.
I very strongly support and echo the concept of a global commonwealth within the space of internet and cyberspace. I think that the notion that we have a potential future where all of us are interlinked, connected, and can exist whereby any individual in the world can talk to, communicate with any other single individual, groups of individuals, is a vision for a future of a borderless world which I'd like to participate in. And I think that the legal principles that make that possible already exist within the frameworks that we have. In making legislation, I would urge that we be careful about focusing on today's technologies to the detriment of thinking about the future of where our technologies will take us. Because as we've seen, the communications tools and platforms that we're using today were tools that we didn't envision 10 years ago. And we may find that we know that technology moves faster than law, faster than regulation, and we may find that we're building systems that aren't able to accommodate, building legal systems that aren't able to accommodate the technological changes, or worse, that we'll be creating eddies or restrictions that force technologies to grow in a way other than they would if they were living in an unfettered and global commonwealth of ideas. I'd also like to point out the concept of the free movement of ideas and how some of our trade laws and corporate and commercial laws potentially act as restrictions to those kinds of ideas, whether it's things like the commercialization of human biology or the effects of the entertainment industry on copyright. In a space of a cultural commons and a global commonwealth of ideas, innovation comes through the potential to have access to other concepts and other communities of ideas. And just as the technology has walls, we also have the potential to put walls on our culture and walls on our concepts. And I would urge that we think very carefully about not creating those blockades in the process of responding to special interests that may exist in this country or in other countries in the OSCE region. Lastly, I think that from the US perspective, it's very important, again, to lead by example. So we have the potential ourselves to create in this country a basis for an open and participatory network of communications. And that in itself is potentially under threat. So we see ongoing discussions about net neutrality, about tiered systems for access. I'm not saying that those discussions are necessarily clear in terms of what is right or what is wrong. In some cases, policy is really unclear as to what a best solution is. But the principle should be the guiding principle that each of us has equal access is very, very important to sustain. And lastly, as regards international engagement and the question of legislation, I think it's very important to look closely at the potentially contradictory roles that the State Department and Commerce departments and other departments and the military as well will play when thinking about how we should be shaping the internet. We aren't necessarily, even within the United States government, in accord. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lee?
Thank you. I want to say that, in conclusion statement, that the Chinese people has been waiting for a like commonwealth of the world for a long time. They have been more than 160,000 uprising events in China last year against the Chinese communist regime. It's horrifying, in a sense that so many people are living in such a misery. As to the U.S. government, I believe that U.S. has the moral authority to lead the world to the land of freedom. And I hope that when the U.S. government deal with the communist regime in China, they don't forget this rule. And also I just want to echo on the Mr. Rohansky's comments on the people's power, because it's ultimately the people who can have the right value, the right sense of judgment, what is right or wrong, to lead the world to freedom. The quitting the Communist Party movement actually has led into this direction, because, as I mentioned, these countries in the East European countries, mostly they are former communist states. The decommunization is extremely important in these areas to really have a right sense of what is freedom. So I hope that, actually I want to just mention over here that the day before yesterday, the U.S. Senate has introduced a resolution 232, which supports this freedom, the quitting the Communist Party movement, and supports the human rights in China. So the U.S. government can play a great role in supporting these people's power and the move to the right direction in those dictatorship countries. And also for the global freedom, internet freedom consortium, it needs more support, because a lot of people know they're doing the great things, but they lack the resource. Actually, Mr. Smith just asked this question to the first panelist already. So this is my hope that things, actually I believe that things will move to the direction we want to see. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles. Well, it looks like the chairman is not going to make it back before the the room reservation expires. I would just ask any of you if you have some final comment that you'd like to make, some point you've not been able to make yet in the hearing. If not, then I will thank very much the witnesses for coming, and to everyone who joined us today. We're adjourned.